On June 7, 1944, somewhere behind Utah Beach in Normandy, a German officer watched something he could not explain. In the span of 2 hours, he counted 117 identical vehicles, small, open-topped, no armor, no weapons visible, rolling inland from the shore at speed. They did not stop. They did not cluster. They scattered across the hedgerow country like water finding cracks in stone, each one carrying a radio, a map case, and 2 or 3 Americans who seemed to already know where they were going. He had expected tanks. He had expected half-tracks. He had prepared positions for those. But these vehicles were something else. Too small to be worth a shell, too fast to be tracked, too numerous to be counted. And they were everywhere. By nightfall, the American units that had landed that morning were coordinating artillery fire, running reconnaissance, evacuating wounded, and laying telephone wire across terrain the Germans had spent 4 years fortifying. The officer did not know it yet, but what he was watching was the answer to a question that German generals would be asked months later. In defeat, in captivity, in the quiet rooms where American military historians sat across from them and asked a simple question. Of everything in the American arsenal, what impressed you the most? Not the Sherman, not the P-47, not the B-17, not the battleship guns that turned hedgerows into moonscapes. The Jeep. A vehicle that weighed 2,400 pounds, had no armor, no cannon, a top speed of 50 miles per hour on a good road, 60 horsepower, less than a German staff car. And yet, when U.S. Army historian Hugh Cole sat down with captured Wehrmacht generals after the war, they told him they admired the Jeep more than anything else in the formidable American arsenal, more than any tank, more than any plane. This is the story of why. If this story helps you see the Second World War differently, hit like and subscribe. It helps these stories reach the people who care about them most. To understand why German generals feared a vehicle with no gun, you first have to understand something most people get wrong about the German army in World War II. The image is familiar. Panzer columns rolling across Poland, tigers in the Russian steppe, mechanized divisions slicing through France in 6 weeks. The word everyone uses is blitzkrieg, lightning war, and it conjures a picture of a fully motorized, fully mechanized military machine. That picture is a myth. Here is the fact that changes everything. Of the 322 German Army and Waffen-SS divisions that existed in November 1943, only 52 were armored or motorized. 52 out of 322. The rest, more than 80% of the entire German army, moved on foot, and their weapons and supply trains were pulled by horses. Hold that number, because it is going to matter. The German army entered the war with 514,000 horses. By 1943, that number had more than doubled. The average strength of horses in the German army throughout the entire war was approximately 1,100,000 animals. A standard German infantry division went to war with roughly 5,500 horses attached. They pulled the artillery, they hauled the ammunition, they carried the food. When a division needed to move, it moved at the speed of a horse, roughly 4 miles per hour on a good road, less in mud, less in snow, and not at all when the horse was dead. Now here is the number you need to compare it to. A single American infantry division, not armored, not mechanized, just a regular infantry division, possessed roughly 1,440 motor vehicles, trucks, ambulances, weapons carriers, command cars, and jeeps. Hundreds of jeeps. The Jeep was the single most numerous vehicle in the American order of battle. Over 640,000 were built during the war, more than all German armored vehicles of every type combined. But production numbers alone do not explain why German generals called the Jeep deadlier than a tank. Producing a lot of something does not make it dangerous. What made the Jeep dangerous was what it did to the speed of the American army. Not just the speed of movement, but something far more important. The speed of decisions. And to understand what that means, you need to see what a Jeep actually carried. Not soldiers, not cargo, not weapons. It carried a radio. That detail, A radio mounted in a quarter-ton truck that could go anywhere at any time, driven by a sergeant or a lieutenant who did not need permission to move, is the detail that broke the German way of war. But to understand how it broke it, you first need to see the moment the Jeep was born. Because the vehicle that terrified German generals almost did not exist. It was designed in 2 days by a man working for free at a company that was nearly bankrupt for an army that did not yet know what it needed. And the deadline was 49 days. On the morning of July 17, 1940, a freelance engineer named Karl Probst drove through the night from Detroit to the small town of Butler, Pennsylvania. He had not been paid. He had no contract. The company that had called him, American Bantam Car Company, had fewer than 500 workers and was nearly bankrupt. What it had was a deadline. The United States Army wanted a prototype of a light reconnaissance vehicle delivered to Camp Holabird, Maryland in 49 days. Of 135 manufacturers contacted, only Bantam had committed to meeting that deadline. Probst sat down at a drafting table the next morning and began sketching. He worked from a set of Army specifications that most engineers considered absurd. 4-wheel drive, a crew of 3, a mounted machine gun, and a total weight under 1,200 pounds. In 2 days, he had a design. In 49 days, the prototype was running. On September 21, 1940, Probst and plant manager Harold Christ climbed into the hand-built vehicle and drove it 170 miles to Camp Holabird. They arrived before the deadline. The Army tested it for weeks. Hills, mud, water crossings, highway runs. The report came back with 4 words that mattered: ample power, all requirements. What happened next is worth paying attention to, because it reveals something about the American system that the German system could never replicate. The Army looked at the Bantam prototype and said, "Good, now we need 600,000 of them." Bantam could not build that many, so the Army handed the blueprints to Willys Overland in Toledo, Ohio, and to Ford in Dearborn, Michigan. Within months, 2 of the largest industrial operations in the world were producing identical vehicles on parallel assembly lines at a rate that would eventually reach 1 Jeep every 90 seconds. Probst was paid $200 for his work. He never received public credit during his lifetime. But the vehicle he sketched in 2 days would become the most produced 4-wheel drive vehicle in history. 640,000 units by the war's end, at a cost of $738.74 each, less than the price of a mid-range piano. Now, here is where most people stop the story. They talk about how many Jeeps were built, how tough they were, how they could go anywhere. All of that is true, but none of it explains why a German general would say the Jeep was more dangerous than a tank. A horse can go anywhere too. Toughness is not a weapon. What made the Jeep a weapon was what it carried on its back seat: a radio, specifically an SCR 510 or an SCR 619, compact FM sets that could transmit and receive while the vehicle was moving across a range of several miles. That radio connected a forward observer to a fire direction center. And that connection, a lieutenant in a Jeep, a radio on the seat beside him, and a wire to every gun in the division, is the thing that German officers could not explain when they were asked about it after the war. Here is what it looked like in practice. Picture a 23-year-old American lieutenant parked on a ridge in a Jeep, binoculars in one hand, radio handset in the other. He sees a German column forming in a tree line 800 yards away. He reads 6 digits off his map, a grid coordinate. He speaks those 6 digits into the handset. 3 minutes later, every howitzer in his battalion is firing at that grid coordinate. If the target is important enough, every gun in the entire division fires, simultaneously, on the same spot, with the first rounds landing before the German column has moved 200 yards. The Germans had artillery too. They had excellent guns. The 88mm was arguably the best dual-purpose weapon of the war. But here is the difference that the Jeep created. The German forward observer did not have a Jeep. He walked, or he rode a horse. When he needed to relocate to see a new sector, he moved at the speed of his legs. When he found a target, he often had to send a runner or use a field telephone connected by wire that had to be laid by hand across open ground. By the time his message reached the battery, the American unit he had spotted was already somewhere else. The American observer drove. When the infantry advanced, he drove forward with them. When the situation changed, he drove to a new position in minutes. He carried his communication with him. He did not wait for wire to be laid. He did not send runners. He spoke, and shells fell. Remember that number from earlier, 1,440 motor vehicles in a single American infantry division. Now think about what that means. It means the Americans did not just have more firepower than the Germans, they had faster firepower. Every rifle company had a jeep with a radio nearby. Every battalion had forward observers who could relocate in minutes. Every regiment could shift its artillery support across its entire front without moving a single gun, just by moving the man in the jeep. The German system was built for a war where the front line held still long enough for a message to travel up the chain, be approved, and travel back down. The American system, the jeep system, was built for a war where the front line moved faster than any message carried on foot. And the Germans were about to discover what that difference looked like on the ground. Because on the 6th of June, 1944, more jeeps landed on the beaches of Normandy in the first 72 hours than the total number of Kübelwagens Germany had produced in the entire war. An LST, landing ship, tank, could carry up to 30 fully assembled jeeps in a single crossing of the English Channel. On the morning of June 6, 1944, hundreds of LSTs were heading for the Normandy coast. By the end of the first day, jeeps were rolling off ramps onto sand that was still littered with obstacles, bodies, and burning wreckage. They did not wait for roads to be cleared. They drove over dunes, through gaps blown in seawalls, across fields that had been flooded by the Germans precisely to stop vehicles. The Germans had flooded those fields to stop tanks. They had not planned for something that weighed 1.25 tons and could be pushed out of a ditch by 2 men. Near Utah Beach on June 7th, an officer from the 709th German Infantry Division stood in an observation post and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. In 2 hours, he counted 117 identical small vehicles driving inland. They moved fast, 30-35 miles per hour on farm tracks, and they scattered in every direction. Some carried officers with map boards. Some carried radio antennas whipping in the wind. Some carried wounded men strapped to stretchers mounted across the hood. A few had reels of telephone wire spinning off the back, laying communication lines as they drove. He wrote in his report a line that would be echoed by German officers across the entire Normandy front in the weeks that followed. "The enemy," he said, "possesses vehicles in quantities we reserved for ammunition rounds." By June 10th, more than 12,000 vehicles had landed in Normandy. Jeeps were the single largest category, and the effect was immediate. Not because of what the jeeps were, but because of what they allowed every American unit to do at the same time. Reconnaissance pushed forward faster than German units could redeploy to meet it. Artillery observers moved to new positions within minutes of an infantry advance, keeping fire support continuous. Wounded men reached aid stations in the rear alive, because a jeep ambulance could cover in 12 minutes what a stretcher team needed 2 hours to walk. Company commanders drove to battalion headquarters for face-to-face coordination, then drove back to their men, a round trip that in a German division required a motorcycle courier and half a day. This is the thing that matters. Pay attention to it, because it is the core of what German generals were trying to describe when they said the jeep was deadlier than a tank. Every one of those functions, reconnaissance, observation, evacuation, communication, command, is not about firepower. It is about time. The jeep compressed time. It made the American army faster at every level simultaneously. Not just the armored spearheads, not just the elite units, every company, every battalion, every regiment, all at once. The Germans had tried to build their own answer to the jeep. In November of 1943, American engineers at Camp Holabird, Maryland, the same facility where Probst had delivered his prototype 3 years earlier, took apart a captured German Kübelwagen, the Volkswagen-based light vehicle that was supposed to fill the same role. They tested it on roads, hills, mud, and sand. Their report was one sentence long where it mattered. The Volkswagen is inferior in every way, except in the comfort of its seating accommodations. But the real problem was not that the Kübelwagen was a worse vehicle. The real problem was that Germany built 50,000 of them in the entire war. America built 640,000 Jeeps. The Kübelwagen had a 22.5 horsepower engine and rear-wheel drive. The Jeep had 60 horsepower and four-wheel drive. The Kübelwagen was assigned to officers and specialists. The Jeep was given to everyone. And that word, everyone, is where the gap becomes a chasm. In the German army, mobility was a privilege. It belonged to panzer divisions, to reconnaissance battalions, to senior commanders. A German infantry company commander walked with his men. His messages traveled by runner or by wire. His wounded waited for horse-drawn wagons. His view of the battlefield extended exactly as far as his own eyes could see from wherever his feet had carried him. In the American army, mobility was standard issue. A company commander had a Jeep. His forward observer had a Jeep. His supply sergeant had a Jeep. The medic had a Jeep. The wire team had a Jeep. Each of those Jeeps carried a man who could make decisions, and a radio that let those decisions reach someone who could act on them in minutes. A German infantry division with 2,000 horses could sustain a march rate of 15 miles per day in good weather. An American infantry division with 1,400 motor vehicles could reposition an entire regiment in hours. Not because the Americans were braver or better trained, because they had wheels under every decision-maker in the chain. This is why the German defensive model in Normandy collapsed faster than anyone, including the Allied planners, had expected. The German doctrine for defending a coastline was built on one assumption, that the attacker would advance in predictable lines that could be channeled into prepared kill zones. Hedgerows, flooded fields, fortified villages, all designed to slow a conventional advance to a crawl. But the Americans did not advance in lines, they flowed. A Jeep found a gap in the hedgerow, and within 20 minutes an infantry platoon was through it. An observer in another Jeep called fire on the German position that was supposed to guard that gap. A third Jeep carried the company commander forward to see the new ground himself. The German defenders, waiting in their positions for an attack that was supposed to come from the front, discovered that the Americans were already behind them. One German officer put it plainly. "The Jeep," he wrote, "gave every American unit the mobility we had achieved only with our elite mechanized forces. We could not establish a continuous front because the Americans simply drove around our positions." But Normandy was the hedgerow country, tight, close, tangled. What the Germans did not yet know was what would happen when the Americans broke out into the open. On August 1st, 1944, Lieutenant General George S. Patton took command of the United States Third Army in northern France. The Allies had spent nearly 2 months grinding through the hedgerows of Normandy, advancing in some sectors less than a mile a day. Operation Cobra had just punched a hole in the German line near St. Lo. What Patton did with that hole changed the shape of the war in Europe. He drove through it. Third Army did not advance the way armies were supposed to advance, methodically, consolidating positions, securing flanks. Patton pushed armored columns through the breach and told them to keep going. And the instrument that made this possible was not the Sherman tank at the tip of the spear. It was the Jeep that ran ahead of it. Patton's reconnaissance doctrine was simple and it was fast. Jeep-mounted scouts from the cavalry reconnaissance squadrons ranged 10, 15, 20 miles ahead of the main armored columns. They carried radios. When they found a bridge intact, they reported it. When they found a German position, they reported its strength, its orientation, and the roads around it. When they found nothing, an open road, an undefended town, a gap between two German units, they reported that too, and that report was often the most valuable of all, because an open road meant the tanks could move. In a German army, reconnaissance was performed by specialized units that reported up a chain of command where decisions were made at the top and passed back down. In Patton's army, the lieutenant in the Jeep often made the decision himself. Found an unguarded bridge? Secure it. Found a gap? Mark it and call the column forward. The time between seeing an opportunity and exploiting it collapsed from hours to minutes. This is what it looked like at speed. In the first 2 weeks of August 1944, Third Army covered 250 miles. In 30 days, it covered 400, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the banks of the Moselle River on the border of Germany. Patton's forces were moving so fast that they routinely overran German headquarters before the officers inside knew the front had shifted. Supply dumps were captured intact. Communication centers were seized before they could send warnings. German commanders on the receiving end of this advance described a disorienting experience. They would receive reports that the Americans were 20 miles to the west, begin preparing defensive positions, and then discover that American jeeps had already been spotted behind them to the east. The front was not a line, it was a cloud that moved in every direction at once. And here is the detail that brings it into focus. Remember the calculation from earlier. A German infantry division marched at 15 miles per day. Patton's reconnaissance jeeps covered 50 miles before breakfast. By the time a German division received an order to move to a blocking position, the Americans had already passed through it, found it empty, reported it clear, and the tanks were rolling. The German High Command tried to react. In late August, Field Marshal Walter Model was given command of the Western Front with orders to stabilize the line. Model was one of Germany's best defensive tacticians. He had earned the nickname the Führer's Fireman for his ability to patch collapsing fronts on the Eastern Front. But Model's methods relied on moving reserves to critical points faster than the enemy could exploit them. On the Eastern Front, against a Soviet army that was powerful but often slow to follow up breakthroughs, this worked. Against Patton, it did not work. Because Model's reserves moved by rail and by road when fuel was available, which increasingly it was not, and Patton's reconnaissance was already watching every road and rail junction within 30 miles of the front. The moment German reserves began to move, American observers in jeeps spotted them, reported them, and artillery or fighter bombers hit them before they reached their positions. This is the deeper answer to the question in the title, and it is worth pausing to make sure it lands. The jeep was not a weapon. It did not shoot anything. It did not blow anything up. What it did was something more dangerous than any gun. It gave the American army a faster nervous system. Think of an army as a body. The infantry is the muscle. The artillery is the fist. The tanks are the armored skin. But the nervous system, the ability to see a threat, send a signal, and respond, is what makes all of those parts work together. Without a fast nervous system, the strongest body in the world just stands there, swinging blind. The German army had excellent muscles. The Wehrmacht's infantry was disciplined and experienced. Its tanks, when they worked, were formidable. Its artillery was accurate and lethal. But its nervous system ran on horses, runners, and field telephones connected by wire that broke under shell fire. It processed information at the speed of 1918. The American Army's nervous system ran on jeeps and radios. It processed information at the speed of 1944. A lieutenant saw something. He drove to where he could see it clearly. He picked up a handset. 3 minutes later, someone who could do something about it already knew. That gap between the speed of a German message and the speed of an American message was not a small advantage. It was the difference between an army that reacted to the last situation and an army that was already acting on the next one. And it widened every day, because the Americans kept building jeeps and the Germans kept losing horses. But here's what makes this story more than a simple tale of industrial superiority. The Germans understood the problem. They could see what the jeep was doing to them. They studied it. They captured them by the hundreds. And then they tried to turn America's own weapon against it, in one of the most audacious deceptions of the entire war. On December 16, 1944, the German army launched its last major offensive in the West. 3 armies, more than 200,000 men, struck through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, hitting a thinly held sector of the American line. The goal was to split the Allied front, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. It was a desperate gamble, and the Germans knew it, but buried inside the order of battle was a unit that had nothing to do with the main assault. It was called Panzer Brigade 150, a name designed to mislead because it was not an armored brigade. It was a commando force of roughly 2,000 men, drawn from every branch of the German military, including former merchant seamen from the Kriegsmarine. They had one skill in common. They spoke English. Their commander was SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, the man who had rescued Mussolini from a mountaintop prison in 1943, and one of the most famous special operations officers in the German military. His mission was called Operation Greif, and its centerpiece was a fleet of captured American jeeps. The plan was precisely what it sounded like. German commandos, wearing American uniforms, driving American jeeps, carrying American identification, would slip through the chaos of the Ardennes breakthrough and race behind Allied lines. They would cut telephone wires, turn road signs, spread false orders, and seize bridges over the Meuse River before the Americans could react. The Germans had spent months preparing. Commandos watched American movies to study accents and slang. They practiced American saluting, casual, loose, nothing like the rigid German style. They studied how Americans walked, how they smoked, how they held a steering wheel. They learned which hand an American used to eat because Europeans hold the fork differently. Every detail mattered because a single mistake would mean a firing squad. And the vehicle at the center of all of it was the Jeep. Not captured tanks, not trucks, Jeeps. Because the Germans understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the Jeep was the vehicle that moved freely everywhere behind American lines. A Jeep did not attract suspicion. A Jeep at a crossroads was invisible. A Jeep driven by men in American uniforms was the perfect Trojan horse. Skorzeny had requested 150 captured Jeeps. He received fewer than a dozen. The German military could not find more, a revealing fact in itself because it meant that despite years of capturing American equipment, the Germans could not accumulate even 150 Jeeps. The Americans, meanwhile, were building that many every 3 hours. The operation launched on the second day of the offensive. Small teams of commandos in Jeeps slipped through gaps in the American line. Some of them succeeded. They cut wires, changed signs, spread confusion. One team told an American military police unit that a major German force was approaching from the north, causing an entire regiment to reposition for an attack that did not exist. But the operation unraveled almost immediately. On December 18th, near the town of Awil in Belgium, American military police stopped a jeep carrying 4 men. They wore American uniforms. They spoke English with convincing accents, but they could not produce the correct identification papers. A search of the vehicle turned up concealed German weapons, explosives, and swastika armbands. Under interrogation, one of the men, Unteroffizier Manfred Pernas, claimed they had been sent to capture General Eisenhower himself. Whether that claim was true or an attempt to cause maximum chaos, it worked. The American High Command went into a state of near paranoia. Checkpoints appeared on every road. Military police stopped every jeep and demanded answers to questions only Americans could answer. What is the capital of Illinois? Who won the World Series in 1943? What is Mickey Mouse's girlfriend's name? Generals were pulled from their vehicles. Eisenhower was confined to his headquarters under armed guard. For a few days, Operation Greif achieved something no German military operation had managed in months. It slowed the American nervous system down. But it did not stop it. And the reason it did not stop it is the reason this story matters. Pernas and 2 other captured commandos, Oberfähnrich Günther Billing and Obergefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt, were tried by military commission at 1st Army headquarters on December 21st. All 3 were found guilty of violating the laws of war and acting as spies. They were executed by firing squad. And Operation Greif collapsed. Not one of its objective bridges was reached, let alone captured. Only one commando team returned to German lines. Skorzeny himself was forced to commit Panzer Brigade 150 as conventional infantry, without their American disguises, without their captured jeeps, in a futile assault that cost the unit heavy casualties. Here is what Greif proved, and it is the piece that connects everything we have seen so far. The Germans looked at the American jeep and saw a vehicle. They thought the advantage was in the machine, its mobility, its access, its invisibility behind friendly lines. So they tried to steal the machine. But the advantage was never in the machine. The advantage was in the system that built 640,000 of them, put a radio in every one, gave one to every company commander in the army, and then told that company commander, you see something, you decide, you act. The Jeep was the visible expression of something the Germans could not capture, a military culture that trusted its lowest-ranking officers to make decisions without waiting for permission from above. Skorzeny put German soldiers in American Jeeps, but he could not put the American system inside those soldiers. And it was that system, not the vehicle, not the radio, not the four-wheel drive, that German generals were really talking about when Hugh Cole asked them what they admired most. But to see the system clearly, you need one more piece. The piece the Germans themselves supplied, in their own words, in their own reports, from the other side of the hill. In the summer and autumn of 1945, a quiet process began in prisoner of war camps and interrogation centers across Germany and the United States. American military historians, men like Hugh Cole, who had served as Patton's historical officer during the campaign across France, sat down with captured German generals and asked them to explain, from their side, what had happened. The results filled thousands of pages. Some became classified studies. Others were folded into the official U.S. Army histories that would be published over the following 2 decades. And buried in those pages, repeated in different words by different officers from different commands, was the same observation. An observation that no one had expected. They did not complain most about American tanks. The Sherman had been outgunned by German armor for most of the war, and the German officers knew it. They did not complain most about American air power, though the fighter bombers had devastated their columns. They did not even complain most about American artillery, though many called it the best in the world. What they described, again and again, was speed. Not the speed of any one vehicle, the speed of the entire American way of fighting. And when the historians pressed them, what enabled that speed? What made it possible? The answers kept circling back to the same thing. The Americans had put a motor vehicle under every man who needed to make a decision. And the man who needed to make a decision was not a general in a headquarters 30 miles behind the front. It was a lieutenant on a ridge, a sergeant at a crossroads, a captain behind a hedgerow. One German officer described the experience of fighting American forces in France with a metaphor that stayed in the files. Fighting the Americans, he said, was like fighting a swarm. You could destroy individual units, but the swarm reorganized faster than you could exploit any success. By the time you advanced to take advantage of a gap, the gap had already been reported, reinforced, and the counterattack was coming from a direction you had not expected. That word, reported, is the word that matters. The gap was reported. Not by a runner who took 45 minutes to reach headquarters. Not by a wire that had been cut by shell fire. By a man in a jeep who drove to where he could see the gap, picked up his radio, and told someone who could send help. Now, to feel what this meant, you need to see the other side. What it was like to be a German officer in 1944, watching the American system operate while your own system was collapsing under the weight of its own limitations. A German infantry division in Normandy moved its artillery by horse, 6 horses per gun, walking in teams along roads that were under constant observation by American spotter planes. When a battery needed to relocate, because an American observer in a jeep had spotted it and called in fire, the battery commander had to hitch the horses, load the ammunition onto wagons, move down a road that might already be targeted, find a new position, unhitch, set up, register the guns, and report ready. That process took hours, sometimes an entire day. An American artillery battery moved by truck. It could displace and be firing again in under 30 minutes. A German regimental commander who needed to coordinate with the division on his flank sent a motorcycle courier. The courier rode exposed roads, often under fire, and the message he carried was already old by the time it arrived. The response came back by the same route, if the courier survived the return trip. Total time for a single exchange? 2 hours minimum, often longer. An American regimental commander picked up a radio in his jeep. Total time? Seconds. A German battalion that discovered an American flanking movement had to send a runner to regiment, which relayed the report to division, which decided on a response, which sent orders back down. By the time the blocking force was organized, the Americans had already completed the flanking movement and were hitting the battalion from behind. An American battalion commander in the same situation drove forward in his jeep, saw the threat himself, radioed his artillery observer, who was also in a jeep 200 yards away, and had shells falling on the approaching enemy column before the German commander had finished writing his message. This was not a gap in courage or training. German soldiers were brave, disciplined, and often tactically brilliant at the squad and platoon level. The gap was architectural. It was built into the bones of two armies that had been constructed by two different industrial civilizations. One civilization could put a motor under every decision-maker and a radio beside every motor. The other could not. Not because its engineers were worse, but because its factories produced 88mm guns instead of jeeps, Tigers instead of radios, and perfection instead of mass. The German system was designed to produce masterpieces, weapons so good that each one could destroy 3 or 4 of the enemies, and by that standard, it succeeded. A Tiger could destroy 4 Shermans, and 88 could stop anything the Allies put on the road. But the American system was not designed to fight masterpiece against masterpiece. It was designed to move faster, decide faster, and adapt faster. And the instrument of that speed was not a wonder weapon. It was a quarter-ton truck with a 60-horsepower engine that any 19-year-old private from Iowa could drive and any mechanic could fix with a wrench and a manual. The Germans built weapons. The Americans built a system. And the Jeep was a circulatory system of that system, the thing that carried its lifeblood, which was not fuel or ammunition, but information. There is one more story that proves it. One moment where every thread in this narrative converges on a single road, in a single week, in the worst winter Europe had seen in a generation. On December 19, 1944, 3 days after the German offensive shattered the American line in the Ardennes, Eisenhower called an emergency meeting at a stone barracks in Verdun, France. The room was cold. The officers wore overcoats. The mood was grim. German armored columns were driving deep into Belgium. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded at Bastogne, a crossroads town that controlled the road network for the entire sector. If Bastogne fell, the German spearheads would have a clear path to the Meuse River. Eisenhower looked at his commanders and said he wanted a counterattack from the south, into the German flank. He turned to Patton. How long would Third Army need to disengage from its current front, turn 90 degrees north, and attack? Patton's answer stunned the room. 48 hours. 3 divisions. The other generals thought he was being reckless. Turning an entire army, 250,000 men, with all their tanks, artillery, trucks, and supply trains, 90 degrees in the middle of winter, across icy roads, in 2 days, was not merely ambitious. It was, by every standard of conventional military planning, impossible. But Patton had not been bluffing, and the reason he had not been bluffing is the reason this story exists. 3 days before the meeting in Verdun, before the German offensive had even begun, Patton's intelligence staff had noticed the buildup in the Ardennes and flagged it as a potential threat. Patton told his staff to begin preliminary planning for 3 contingency scenarios, each involving a turn north. His operations officer, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, had already sketched movement routes. His signal corps had already identified radio frequencies for the new axis of advance. And the men who had scouted those routes confirmed which roads could handle tank traffic, identified which bridges could bear the weight of a Sherman, and reported which villages were clear of German forces. Those men had done it in jeeps. In the days before the Verdun meeting, reconnaissance teams from Third Army's cavalry squadrons were already probing north in jeeps through freezing rain and snow, mapping the roads that Patton's divisions would use. This is the moment where every piece locks together. Think about what Patton actually promised at Verdun. Not just movement. Any army can march in a direction. He promised a coordinated attack. That means artillery registered on new targets, ammunition pre-positioned at new supply points, communication nets reconfigured for a new axis, air support redirected, medical evacuation routes established. All of it in 48 hours in December in the Ardennes. Every one of those functions traveled by jeep. Artillery liaison officers drove ahead in jeeps to coordinate with the infantry units they would be supporting. Forward observers raced to new positions to begin registering targets before the guns arrived. Signal corps teams in jeeps laid wire and established radio relay points along the new routes. Supply officers drove the roads ahead of the columns, marking fuel and ammunition drop points. Medical jeeps identified where the aid stations would go. The army did not just move north. Its entire nervous system, the web of observers, communicators, coordinators, and decision-makers that made it function, picked up and redeployed in 2 days. Because every node in that web had wheels. On December 26, 1944, at 4:45 in the afternoon, Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, broke through the German encirclement and made contact with the defenders of Bastogne. The siege was lifted. Patton's Third Army had covered over 100 miles of frozen roads, fought through German resistance the entire way, and arrived when and where he had promised. Here is what the German side of that week looked like. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, was designed to be a blitzkrieg. Fast armored columns punching through weak American lines, racing for the Meuse. But the offensive depended on captured American fuel to keep moving, because Germany did not have enough of its own. The lead panzer divisions carried fuel for roughly 60 miles. After that, they needed to find American fuel dumps or stop. They stopped. Not because the Americans defended every fuel dump, some were overrun, but because the German supply system could not keep up with its own spearheads. The ammunition came forward on horse-drawn wagons that bogged down in snow and mud. The reinforcements marched on foot, arriving exhausted and hours behind schedule. The communication between the advancing columns and the headquarters directing them broke down as wire was cut and distances stretched beyond radio range. The same army that had launched a surprise offensive with 200,000 men could not sustain it for 2 weeks, because its nervous system was too slow. Its muscles outran its brain. Its spearheads drove into the dark, blind, deaf, and increasingly out of fuel, while behind them the supply trains crept forward at the speed of a horse in snow. And coming from the south, Patton's army, informed by Jeep-mounted scouts, coordinated by Jeep-mounted officers, supplied by Jeep-led convoys, hit them in the flank at exactly the moment their momentum was failing. A tank is a weapon. It kills what is in front of it. A Jeep is a nervous system. It tells the tank where to go, when to fire, and what has changed since the last order was given. In the Ardennes, the Germans had tanks. The Americans had a system. The system won. And the German generals, sitting in Hugh Cole's interrogation rooms months later, knew exactly why. They had lived through the answer. They had watched it happen in real time. An army that could turn 90 degrees in 48 hours, because every man who needed to decide something had a Jeep and a radio and the authority to use both. What remained was the quietest part of the story. What happened to the men, the machines, and the question that started it all? In the autumn of 1945, in a quiet room at a former German military facility, Hugh Cole sat across a table from a man who had commanded divisions against the American army. Cole was 35 years old. He had spent the war as Patton's historical officer, riding behind the front in a jeep with a notebook, interviewing soldiers while the battles were still going on. Now the battles were over, and he was interviewing the other side. The German general had fought in France, in the Ardennes, and in the final retreat across the Rhine. He had seen tigers burn and panthers abandoned for lack of fuel. He had watched fighter bombers turn columns into scrap metal. He had experienced the full weight of American firepower: naval guns, heavy bombers, massed artillery, armored divisions. Cole asked him, of everything in the American arsenal, what impressed you the most? The general did not hesitate. The Jeep, he said. Cole would hear variations of this answer from other officers in other rooms over the following weeks. Some emphasized the vehicle's ubiquity, the fact that it was everywhere, at every level, in every function. Some emphasized the speed it gave to American operations, the ability to see, report, and react faster than the German system could process what was happening. Some simply said, "You gave every sergeant the mobility of a general." That was the sentence. You gave every sergeant the mobility of a general. Not every sergeant the firepower of a general, the mobility. The ability to be in the right place at the right time, to see the situation for himself, and to act on it without waiting. In 1963, Karl Probst died in Detroit, Michigan. He was 80 years old. He had never received public recognition for designing the vehicle that George Marshall called America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. He had been paid $200. The blueprints he drew in 2 days became the template for 640,000 machines that changed the shape of a world war and then changed the shape of the peacetime world that followed. He did not receive a medal, a plaque, or a ceremony. He was a freelance engineer who answered a phone call, drove through the night to a factory in Pennsylvania, and solved the problem. Hugh Cole went on to write 2 volumes of the official history of the United States Army in World War II, the Lorraine Campaign and the Ardennes, Battle of the Bulge. He spent decades at the Office of the Chief of Military History in Washington. He died in 2005 at the age of 94. Ernie Pyle, the correspondent who called the Jeep a divine instrument of wartime locomotion and wrote that he did not think America could continue the war without it, was killed on April 18, 1945, on the island of Ie Shima, near Okinawa. He was riding in a Jeep with a battalion commander when a Japanese machine gun opened fire from a coral ridge. A bullet struck him below the helmet. He was 44 years old. The soldiers who found him placed a marker at the spot. It read, "At this spot, the 77th Infantry Division lost a buddy, Ernie Pyle. He had been riding in a Jeep until the last minute of his life. Of the 640,000 Jeeps built during the war, most were left where the war ended, in fields across France, on Pacific Islands, in motor pools in Germany and Japan. Thousands were sold as surplus. Some were shipped to developing countries where they opened roads that had never seen a motor vehicle. A few are still running today, maintained by collectors who understand what they are preserving. But the thing those collectors cannot preserve is what the Jeep actually was. It was never really a vehicle. It was a decision made physical. It was the American belief, instinctive, untheorized, built into the industrial DNA of a country that mass-produced everything from rifles to refrigerators, that speed matters more than perfection. That a good decision made now beats a perfect decision made too late. That the man closest to the problem should be the man who solves it, and that man needs wheels and a radio, not a horse and a courier. The Germans built the finest tanks in the world, and every one of them moved at the speed of the last order received from a headquarters that was already behind events. The Americans built a quarter-ton truck that cost less than a piano, and it carried the one thing no tank could carry, the ability to change your mind before the enemy changed his. That is why German officers said the Jeep was deadlier than a tank, not because of what it destroyed, because of what it made possible. An army that could think at the speed of the road, decide at the speed of radio, and turn on a dime in the worst winter of the century, because every man who mattered had a Jeep and the freedom to use it. Thank you for watching. I mean that. 63 minutes is a long time to spend with one story, and the fact that you are still here tells me something about who you are. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button. It is a small thing, but it helps the algorithm show these stories to other people who care about this history, and there are more of them out there than you might think. If you have not subscribed yet, now is a good time, and hit that notification bell so you do not miss the next one. I would love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you watching from today? And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a parent, a grandparent, an uncle, tell us about them. Their stories deserve to be remembered. Thank you. I will see you in the next one.